everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Thriving with Rachael and Dr. Lou. Thanks for joining us tonight. I just wanted to kind of pick up a little bit from where we left off last week. I know we touched on the grief process and kind of what that looks like, and touched on the continuum basis, or the continuum concept rather. Really working on taking judgment out of your day-to-day experiences and learning from them and choosing to change as opposed to beating yourself up. And I wanted to revisit not only that concept, but this process of grief, and just kind of apply it maybe in a more broad spectrum than most of us are used to. So that's kind of what we were looking to touch on today. We had several questions around that topic that we'll try to get to. I just want to kind of check in with you too, kind of see how you're doing this week. And
well, it's been another week, and things are moving along, getting a little bit back to normal, if you will. But to pick up on what you were saying, I think the grief process is also can be thought of as a transitional process. You know, whenever we lose something, it doesn't have to just be from death. It could be loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of physical ability, independence. If you're sick for an extended period of time, your ability to be well and do the things that you normally would be doing. There's lots of ways that we can experience grief throughout our life. And recognizing, you know, as you were pointing out, Rachel, the idea of judgment and how we evaluate ourselves is one of the key factors to how well, if you will, we grieve. And to your question about, you know, is there a right way to grieve? Or, you know, many people were asking, you know, I had one question about, you know, somebody had passed away 2 years ago and she still feels just as sad. And, you know, that makes sense. You know, at any point in time, if you focus on the loss that you experienced, those same feelings, just like when it occurred, will surface again. You'll feel that. And you'll have that same kind of reaction in some ways. You know, for me, if I think about whether it's my dad who passed away a couple weeks ago, or my mom who passed away 7 years ago, I can get really down and really be tearful.
Depending on how you look at it, depending on how you process
exactly.
it, right? Which isn't to say that there's a right or wrong with that by any means, or that you shouldn't focus on the fact that it's sad. Grief of anything, loss of anything, when you look at the loss angle of it, is sad, like you said. Loss of time, loss of relationship, loss of ability. When you hone in on those things, that perspective, of course, is going to generate uncomfortable feelings. And so the goal isn't to negate those or to not think about the loss necessarily. The idea is to spread out the experience that you have and not have that as the only focus, right? Because, you know, we are able, I think, to look at things in a really positive light. Like, you know, especially if, you know, time has passed and you have lost a loved one, to be able to have an experience, even if it's for a short period of time, to reminisce about the funny things and, you know, the things that make you laugh and smile about that person, as opposed to the fact that you're not going to have that anymore, which, again, depending on where you are in this process, if you will, or in this transition, might be like a back and forth. You know, I know even
definitely.
The other week when it first happened, it was like, you know, I was sad, but then I was, you know, laughing about, you know, meatballs or something, and then, you know, going back to being sad because I noticed I would never have that again. And so it can be a back and forth process. Losing, you know, a relationship that you didn't think was ever going to end, or like you said, loss of time. The pandemic, I think, is a perfect example of the time we feel like we lost with traveling, seeing loved ones, you know, things that we are normally used to doing, and not having been able to do that at any one point maybe in the last year. Focusing on the fact that I wasn't able to travel, which I've very much been focusing on because I love to travel, is really depressing to think about, that I didn't get to go on trips that I had planned. But if I look at the things I did do with my time, actually did spend more time with my immediate family than I really ever have, and, you know, getting into yoga that I never thought I would ever have time for, you know, random things like that, doing projects around my house. You know, when I hone in on the things that I did do with that time instead of the lost time, it generates a different emotion, which then generates a different experience, right?
So again, the idea of perception and what we choose to focus on. You know, last week we talked about what's within our control, and we identified behaviors and intentional thoughts. And what do we choose to focus on really can dictate and predict, if you will, how you're going to feel. And subsequently what you'll likely do.
With that, yeah.
So it's important to notice, again, awareness is key in all of this, to be aware of and notice, how am I treating myself? What am I saying to myself? What are those automatic messages that we're giving ourselves regarding where we are on the continuum? And if we are grieving, whether it's something that you experience from a loss of a loved one through death, or whether it's a relationship, or many of the other losses that we just referenced, whether it's something that just happened or happened years ago, I think it's important to tune into what is the message that we're telling ourselves, which ones are we choosing to focus on, and that will often be able to be used as a predictor to determine how you're going to feel. Which goes back to, what do we want? How do we want to feel? How do we want to focus our life, and how do we want to thrive? And that gives us options. It allows us the ability and the power to then make different choices, and then to create a different way of experiencing life.
And to kind of piggyback off the idea of what do I want, kind of reference the continuum concept from last week, we talked about going towards the more helpful end of the spectrum, if you will, is also reinforcing values. So even referencing, what values do I have, and am I reinforcing them with what I'm doing every day and what I'm focusing on every day? And if the answer is no, that's another red flag of, okay, well, what do I need to do then today, or what do I want to do today to reinforce those values?
Yeah.
Right? Kind of get back to the basics a little bit.
Absolutely. And so that's, an ongoing process. It's an ongoing challenge in many ways, because as we mentioned several times now throughout our episodes, that life is, throws us curves once in a while. Those things that are outside of our control will often create our challenges in life, and how we respond to them is really the key to whether we're thriving or not. And so, like you were pointing out, it's important to become aware of what are those challenges, what are the things that life is presenting to us, and then how are we going to respond to that.
And I think when you said response, I want to, at least for the purposes of this podcast, kind of highlight what we mean by response versus reaction. And so when we listed off last week of the things that are in our direct control versus not in our direct control, that's the difference between reaction and response. So reaction is typically the automatic part, right? So automatically how I think or perceive something, automatically how I feel and kind of react to something that happens. Response is focusing on the things I choose, right? How do I choose to respond? So you might have an automatic reaction to something that's maybe feels uncomfortable or negative. That doesn't mean you have to continue with that intentionally, though. So if you are, say you get let go from a job, you lost a job, and your instant automatic is, I can't believe that happened, what am I going to do? You might start feeling worried, overwhelmed, so that might be your automatic, your reaction to whatever to that instance or that circumstance. Do you want to continue down that path, though? A lot of us might go into problem solving, intentionally thinking about, okay, well, I didn't really like that job, maybe, or this gives me an opportunity to find a different one, or something to refocus or pivot. You don't have to reinforce the first thing. You can choose, to what you were saying, to ask yourself, even though I feel this way and I'm thinking these things, do I want that? Do I want to stay in a state of worry? Do I want to stay in a headspace that focuses on the fact that this came out of nowhere and that I'm not going to be okay? Because even though those are the automatic, that's not necessarily, at least for me, where I would want to stay. That's not in line with my values. That's just the first thing.
And as you're describing those things, I can imagine, and I can even hear it. People are most likely saying, yes, but. Yes, but I just got let go. Like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to pay, rent or mortgage, or, my family's depending on me. Like, how am I going to get another job? Like, it's COVID. Like, who's hiring? Like, many of these thoughts, these worries, are real. It's important.
Valid.
It's important to hear that they are valid, and that they are something that you have to acknowledge. Yet it doesn't have to determine your response.
The next move, right?
So being intentional will allow you to choose what's your response going to be to the situation. And if it's really difficult, that means it requires more work. It may require more resources, more supports. It may require you to change some of your expectations. It may require you to adjust some of what you're willing to do for the time being. You know, we've mentioned this many times, that through this past year or so of dealing with COVID, it has taught us that we need to be adaptable. The more that we can adapt to life, the more we will thrive, the more we will move up that continuum. And if we can allow ourselves to have the freedom to pivot and to be flexible, not only in what we do, but how we think about things, life is a lot better. It's a lot more enjoyable, and we get to thrive much more when we're doing that.
Yeah, but if we were going to go into more of a role play here, yeah, I hear you, and these things keep happening to me. It's like everywhere I look, something's happening, whether somebody's treating me poorly or, you know, I don't have a good day at work and things just don't work out for me. Like that's just always happens. So I hear you, but I don't know how you just like swing the way you look at it.
One of the things that somebody told me a long time ago is we often find what we look for. If I'm looking for times where people treat me poorly, when things don't go my way, we'll find that. I'll find it. Anybody will find that, because
so I'm doing it to myself.
What you focus on determines how you will then respond to other things and also feel, and also dictate in many ways how you will then thrive. So we are doing things to ourselves with our intentional thought.
So I'm intentionally doing this to myself?
What your intentional thoughts are doing is creating this.
So what would my intentional thought be there in that example?
Looking at people treating me poorly, noticing when somebody didn't hold the door for me, or didn't return my call, or didn't give me the job. Those are things that are real. They're valid. They happened. Yet at the same time, what else happened that day? What did you do that day that was good, that was positive, that was helpful? If we go back to the continuum concept, you know, there are many things that we do that are either less helpful or more helpful. And if we are aware of what those things are, we can intentionally choose to do it more or less.
So for instance, circumstance was something we mentioned outside of your control. So circumstance are other people, which could be the person not returning the phone call or the person not holding the door, let's say. So that's something else out of my direct control that happens. You're saying my response then, focusing on the fact that that keeps happening and that always happens to me, and so like honing in on those things as maybe, you're saying that part, me responding to it and honing in on it, is the part that's creating the experience to be less pleasant.
Right. Because let's face it, if we choose to keep track of how many times somebody has treated us poorly, how many times I've gone through the day and somebody didn't respond the way I wanted them to, how else would you feel? I mean, it's predictable, right? In many ways, if we choose to focus on the things that don't go our way, the things that happen to us that are outside of our control and not what we want, we're going to feel bad. We're going to feel frustrated. And I'm not saying those things don't happen. They do. They happen to all of us.
And are frustrating.
And are frustrating. They're disappointing. It does make you sad. It does make you upset. The question that you need to ask yourself is, what do you want? How do you want to be?
Do I want to stay in that upset space, or do I want to either pivot and engage in something completely different, or even change the perspective on the original experience?
For example, if somebody didn't hold the door for me as we're both walking out of Wawa, I could immediately think, what a jerk. Like, what's it take? 2 seconds to like hold the door? Like,
Clearly my arms are full.
Clearly I have both cups of coffee in my hands. Like, why couldn't you? Another way of looking at it is, what if they just experienced a loss? What if their mind is so preoccupied on that they weren't even noticing me?
So
it's very
maybe it
possible.
has nothing to do with you.
Maybe, right? I think a lot of times we think that other people are focused on us.
As much as we are.
As much as we are.
Yeah.
The reality is, most people are not focusing on us. Most people are focused on their own world. It's just the way it is. And if we recognize that that is the way it is, then it changes our perspective. It changes our response to those things. If I choose to recognize that that person may have experienced a loss, may have had something else going on, then I can understand why they may not have held the door. And is that okay?
And I know, at least for me, when I brought this up to people before, they're like, well, but what if they did intentionally not hold the door? And at the end of the day, to what you were saying earlier, we aren't going to know. We're not going to know either way, right?
But let's go with that. Let's say they are intentionally mean and rude to us.
What does that mean?
We still have a choice of how we respond to that. You know, I can still say, yeah, he's a jerk. And on spite of that, I'm going to have a good day. Right?
Right.
In fact, I'm actually going to hold the door for the next 5 people that come through the door just so that they can have a smile on their face. Because that's how I want to be.
Right.
I think too often we spend our time determining how we're going to be in reaction to how others treat us.
Or any of the things outside of our direct control, right?
Yeah.
The circumstance of the day, how other people treat us, for sure. I mean, things that have happened in the past or we predict in the future, you know, anything on that list. I totally agree. I think we use that as a gauge for how the day's going to be.
Yeah.
As opposed to your question of what do I want for the day?
I'd much rather choose what I want and be in control as opposed to wait to determine if somebody's going to treat me the way I want to then decide whether I have a good day or a bad day.
Which I think is a lot more, or a lot less predictable then, right? It's not as stable, if you will, because then it's left up to the forces of the world, if you will, like other people and, you know, anything else on that list. So it doesn't make it like a guarantee, if you will. But if you go into the day asking consistently, what do I want my day to look like, then it's always in your court.
Yeah.
Right?
At least that's what I think.
I don't know. Maybe maybe we've convinced ourselves of all these things.
We may have. Maybe we're in our own delusion and just living life in a bubble.
I don't know. It's working.
It's working. I mean,
don't stop what works.
Yeah, if it's working for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, so I hope that's helpful to you guys. I hope that we've talked a little bit about the grieving process and how there's different ways that we can experience grief. It doesn't just have to be the loss of a loved one. It can be many different ways of experiencing life that we can experience a loss. And it needs to be kept in a context of recognizing what happened and how you choose to respond to it as opposed to react to it, and recognizing that we are on a continuum and that there are certain things in life that we don't have control over, and that will determine those ebbs and flows to our life situations.
And noticing those ebbs and flows, and when you're noticing them, validating them, as opposed to just honing in and staring at the fact that they exist, I think is another key point that I picked up from today. Because that'll help you navigate it differently, as opposed to feeling like things keep happening to me, which I think that perspective makes it feel really daunting and overwhelming and not in my control. So really noticing the ebbs and flows as part of life, expect them in a non-negative way, I guess, or I guess that's the best way to put it. So just kind of honing in on that and noticing that concept from last week. So
keep the questions, keep the comments coming. Really looking forward to your response to our episode tonight. Next week we have a live broadcast. We're going to have Julia King join us, who is our therapist who runs our young adult program in King of Prussia. And so we're going to be talking about young adults and maybe how they're processing things.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's along the lines of the grieving process and the transition that they've been going through even in the last year, or just transitions in general? I know a lot of what we focus on with that population in general is transitions in life, going from, you know, living at home to being independent, and kind of what that's like and how to help them navigate that. So any questions that you guys have ahead of time, or feel free to go through our website or Facebook for the live link to call in and ask questions that way. But we'll see you next week.